The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting golden rays across the nursery where 5-year-old Prince George sat on his favorite blue carpet. His wooden toy trains were scattered around him, but today he couldn't focus on playing. Something big was happening, and everyone in the palace seemed to be moving with unusual purpose and excitement. "George, darling, come here," called his mother, Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, from the doorway. She looked beautiful in a soft cream dress, her hair perfectly styled, but George could see something different in her eyes today. There was a sparkle there, mixed with what looked like happy nervousness. George scrambled to his feet, his train forgotten. "Mummy, is today the special day? The day we're going to church?" he asked, tugging at his small navy shorts. He had been hearing whispers about this day for weeks now, ever since his baby sister Charlotte had arrived and changed everything in their household. Catherine knelt down to his level, smoothing down his unruly blonde hair that always seemed to stick up no matter how much she tried to tame it. "Yes, sweetheart. Today is Princess Charlotte's christening day. Do you remember what we talked about? How she's going to wear the same special gown that you wore when you were a tiny baby." George nodded solemnly, though he couldn't quite remember being that small. The idea that he was once as tiny as Charlotte seemed impossible to him. His baby sister was so small and fragile, always sleeping or crying, and he had been told he needed to be very gentle around her. Today felt different, though. Today felt important in a way that made his stomach flutter with excitement. From down the hallway came the sound of his father's voice, Prince William, talking to someone on the phone. George could hear words like security and arrangements and media, though he didn't understand what they meant. What he did understand was that today wasn't just special for their family, but for lots of other people too. "Can I see Charlotte now?" George asked, bouncing slightly on his toes. He had been asking this question every morning for the past week, ever since he learned about the christening. The anticipation was almost too much for his 5-year-old patience to handle. "Soon, my love," Catherine replied, standing up and taking his hand. "First, we need to get you properly dressed. Nanny is waiting to help you with your special outfit." She led him toward his dressing room, where his formal christening clothes were laid out carefully on the small chair. As they walked through the palace corridors, George noticed that everything seemed extra clean and shiny today. The paintings on the walls appeared to gleam more brightly, and he could smell the fresh flowers that had been placed in vases throughout the rooms. Even the staff members they passed seemed to be walking a little straighter, their uniforms more crisp than usual. "Why is everyone acting so fancy today, Mummy?" George asked, his curiosity getting the better of him as they passed a maid who curtsied deeply when she saw them. Catherine smiled, squeezing his small hand gently. "Because today is very special, George. When a member of our family is christened, it's not just important to us, but to people all over the country and the world. They want to celebrate with us and wish Charlotte well." George pondered this as they reached his room. The idea that people he had never met cared about his baby sister was both wonderful and a little overwhelming. He thought about all the times photographers had taken his picture and how his parents always told him to wave and smile. Maybe today there would be even more cameras than usual. Nanny Maria was waiting with his outfit ready. The formal shorts and shirt looked much fancier than his everyday clothes, and George could see that extra care had been taken to make sure everything was perfect. His small shoes had been polished until they gleamed like mirrors. "You're going to look so handsome today, Prince George," Nanny Maria said warmly as she helped him change. Just like a proper big brother should on such an important day. The mention of being a big brother made George's chest swell with pride. It was still a new feeling, this responsibility of having a little sister to protect and care for. Sometimes it felt heavy, like when Charlotte cried and he didn't know how to help. But other times, like now, it felt wonderful and important. As Nanny Maria buttoned his shirt and combed his hair once more, George found himself thinking about what the day might bring. He had been to church before, of course, but never for something as special as this. He wondered if Charlotte would cry during the ceremony, or if she would sleep like she usually did. He hoped she would be good, so that everyone would see how perfect his little sister was. Through his bedroom window, George could see cars beginning to arrive at the palace gates. Official-looking vehicles with flags and important people getting out. His excitement grew as he realized that all these people were coming to see Charlotte, his baby sister, on her special day. The palace buzzed with activity as George made his way down the grand staircase, his small hand gripping the polished banister. His formal outfit felt strange and stiff compared to his usual play clothes, but he walked carefully, remembering his mother's words about being on his best behavior today. The sound of his polished shoes on the marble steps echoed through the hallway. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, George caught sight of his grandparents arriving in the main entrance hall. Queen Elizabeth II stood regally in a bright blue coat and matching hat, her familiar handbag hanging from her arm. Beside her, Prince Philip looked distinguished in his formal suit, though George noticed he seemed to be moving a bit more slowly than usual. "Ah, there's our young prince," Queen Elizabeth said with a warm smile as she spotted George approaching. Despite her formal appearance, her eyes held the same gentle kindness they always did when she looked at her great-grandchildren. "Don't you look splendid today, George?" George performed a small bow, just as he had been taught, though he couldn't hide his excitement completely. "Granny, is everyone really coming just to see Charlotte?" he asked, his eyes wide with amazement. "Indeed they are, my dear boy," the Queen replied, adjusting her gloves. "Your sister is very special, and today marks an important moment in her life and in the life of our family. You should feel very proud to be her big brother." Prince Philip ruffled George's carefully combed hair, earning a gentle look of reproach from Catherine, who had just appeared at the top of the stairs. "The boy needs to look presentable for the photographers, Philip," she said with a smile, though there was no real annoyance in her voice. George looked up at his great-grandfather with admiration. Even though Prince Philip was much older, George always felt like he understood the adventure and excitement that life in the royal family could bring. "Grandpa Philip, will there be lots of people at the church?" George asked. "More than you can count, young man," Prince Philip replied with a wink. "But don't let that worry you. Just remember to stand tall and smile when they take your picture. You're representing the family today." From somewhere deeper in the palace came the soft sound of a baby crying, and George's attention immediately shifted. "That's Charlotte," he exclaimed, looking toward the sound. "Can I see her now? Is she getting ready too?" Catherine had descended the stairs and now stood beside them, looking every inch the duchess she had become. "She's with her nanny, getting dressed in her christening gown. Would you like to come and see her before we leave for the church?" George nodded eagerly, practically bouncing with anticipation. The crying had stopped, which he hoped meant Charlotte was feeling better. Sometimes she seemed so unhappy, and he worried about her in ways he couldn't quite express. But today was supposed to be a happy day for her. They made their way through the palace corridors toward the nursery, passing more staff members who smiled and nodded respectfully. George noticed that some of them looked almost as excited as he felt. He was beginning to understand that this day was special for everyone, not just his family. When they reached the nursery door, Catherine paused and knelt down beside George. "Now remember, Charlotte is still very small and delicate. Today might be a little overwhelming for her, with all the people and attention. We need to be extra gentle and patient with her." George nodded seriously, understanding the importance of what his mother was telling him. He had been learning about being gentle since Charlotte arrived, but today it seemed even more crucial. As Catherine opened the door to the nursery, George held his breath with anticipation. Inside the room, Charlotte lay in her elaborate bassinet, wearing the most beautiful white gown George had ever seen. The fabric seemed to shimmer in the light streaming through the windows, and there was delicate lace and embroidery that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The same gown that he had worn as a baby, though he couldn't remember it, now looked absolutely perfect on his tiny sister. "Oh," George whispered, struck by how different Charlotte looked in her special outfit. She seemed even smaller somehow, but also more important, like a real princess from one of his storybooks. She looks like an angel, Mummy. Charlotte's eyes were open, and she seemed alert and calm for the moment. Her tiny hands moved slightly, and George found himself stepping closer to the bassinet, drawn by an overwhelming desire to protect and care for this little person who shared his family. "Can I talk to her?" George asked quietly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment. "Of course, darling," Catherine replied, her voice soft with emotion as she watched her children together. George leaned carefully over the bassinet, his face serious and gentle. "Hello, Charlotte," he whispered. "Today is your special day. Everyone wants to meet you and see how beautiful you are. I'm going to be right there with you, so don't be scared, okay?" As if she could understand him, Charlotte's tiny hand moved toward George's voice, and for a moment, brother and sister seemed to be having their own private conversation. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of the baby and the distant preparations happening throughout the palace. The motorcade that would take the royal family to St. Mary Magdalene Church was already waiting in the palace courtyard when George finally tore himself away from Charlotte's side. Through the tall windows, he could see the gleaming black cars lined up perfectly, their flags fluttering gently in the summer breeze. Security personnel moved efficiently around the vehicles, checking and double-checking every detail. Prince William appeared in the nursery doorway, looking handsome in his formal suit, but with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a new father managing his second major royal event with a tiny baby. "Everyone ready?" he asked, though George could tell from his father's voice that he was asking more for reassurance than information. "Almost, darling," Catherine replied, carefully lifting Charlotte from her bassinet. The baby stirred slightly, but remained peaceful, her beautiful christening gown cascading over her mother's arms like flowing water. George watched in fascination as Catherine moved with practiced confidence, supporting Charlotte's tiny head and speaking to her in the gentle, musical voice she used only for the baby. As they prepared to leave the nursery, George felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. The palace had been exciting but safe, familiar territory where he knew every corridor and hiding spot. Going out into the world, especially on such an important day, always felt like stepping into unknown adventure. "George, you'll ride with Daddy and me," Catherine explained as they made their way toward the entrance. "Charlotte will be very safe with us, and you can help make sure she stays calm during the car ride." The thought of having a job to do helped settle George's nerves. Being useful, being needed, made him feel more grown-up and confident. As they approached the main entrance, he could hear the distant sound of crowds and cameras, a low hum of excitement that seemed to grow louder with each step. When the palace doors opened, George was momentarily overwhelmed by the sight that greeted them. Photographers lined the drive, their cameras already clicking and flashing despite the family not having fully emerged yet. Beyond the palace gates, he could see crowds of people gathered, many waving flags and holding flowers. "Remember what we practiced?" William said quietly to George as they paused for a moment before stepping outside. "Wave if you feel comfortable, but don't worry if you don't want to. Just stay close to Mummy and me." George nodded, taking a deep breath as they stepped into the bright sunlight. The sound of the cameras became a constant clicking like mechanical insects, but somehow it felt less scary than he had expected. The people beyond the gates seemed happy and excited, not frightening at all. Some called out, "Hello, Prince George," and he found himself smiling almost without thinking. As they approached their car, George noticed how carefully everyone handled Charlotte. Catherine moved slowly and smoothly, protecting the baby from the bright lights and loud sounds. A palace aide held a small blanket ready to shield Charlotte's face if needed, and William stayed close beside them, his hand protectively hovering near his wife and daughter. Getting into the car required careful coordination. George climbed in first, settling into his special car seat that had been fitted perfectly for the journey. Catherine followed, cradling Charlotte with extraordinary care as she navigated the car door and seat belts. William took his place beside them, and George noticed how his father's shoulders relaxed slightly once they were all safely inside the vehicle. "How are you feeling, Charlotte?" George asked softly as the car began to move. The baby's eyes were wide open, taking in the new sights and sound around her. She seemed curious rather than frightened, which made George proud. His little sister was being very brave on her special day. As their motorcade left the palace grounds, George pressed his face to the window and watched the crowds of people lining the streets. Many held cameras and phones, trying to catch a glimpse of the royal family as they passed. Children his age waved enthusiastically from their parents' shoulders, and George found himself waving back, delighted by their excitement. "Look, Charlotte," he said, turning back to his sister. "All those people came to see you today. They think you're very important." Charlotte made a soft sound that George chose to interpret as agreement, which made him giggle quietly. The drive to the church took them through the beautiful Norfolk countryside, past fields and villages where more people had gathered along the route. George had made this journey many times before to visit his great-grandmother at Sandringham, but today it felt completely different. Today they weren't just going to church for a regular Sunday service. They were going for Charlotte's christening, her official welcome into the Church of England and into the long tradition of royal ceremonies that stretched back hundreds of years. "Is Charlotte nervous, do you think?" George asked his parents as they neared the church. He could see the ancient stone building in the distance, its tower reaching toward the cloudy sky. Even from far away, he could tell that today was different from any other Sunday. Cars and people surrounded the normally quiet country church. "I think she's excited," Catherine replied, looking down at Charlotte with infinite tenderness. "Just like we all are. This is a very special day for our whole family, and Charlotte gets to be the star of the show." George considered this as they approached the church grounds. Being the star sounded wonderful and terrifying at the same time. He hoped Charlotte would enjoy her moment in the spotlight, and he promised himself silently that he would do everything he could to help make her christening day perfect. St. Mary Magdalene Church looked like something from a fairy tale as their car approached the ancient building. The stone walls, weathered by centuries of Norfolk weather, glowed warmly in the afternoon light. George pressed his nose to the car window, marveling at how the normally quiet country church had been transformed for Charlotte's special day. Flowers decorated the entrance, and he could see photographers positioned carefully around the grounds, their long camera lenses pointed toward the path the family would walk. "It's so pretty, Mummy," George whispered, not wanting to wake Charlotte, who had dozed off during the car ride. Her tiny face looked peaceful against the elaborate white lace of her christening gown, and George felt a surge of protective love for his sleeping sister. As their car came to a gentle stop, George could see other familiar cars arriving. His grandparents, Prince Charles and Camilla, emerged from one vehicle, both dressed elegantly for the occasion. Charles looked distinguished in his formal suit, while Camilla wore a beautiful cream-colored outfit that complemented the solemnity of the day. From another car, George spotted Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, along with her siblings, Pippa and James. "Look, Charlotte," George said softly as Catherine gently stirred the baby awake. "All our family is here for your christening. Grandpa Charles and Granny Camilla and Grandpa Michael and Granny Carol too." William opened the car door and stepped out first, immediately offering his hand to help Catherine emerge while she carefully protected Charlotte from the sudden brightness and camera flashes. George followed, remembering to stand straight and tall as he had been taught. The moment his feet touched the ground, he could hear the excited murmur from the crowds gathered behind the barriers. The walk to the church entrance felt both very long and surprisingly short. George stayed close to his mother's side, occasionally reaching out to gently touch Charlotte's tiny hand that peeked out from her gown. The baby's eyes were wide open now, taking in the new environment with what seemed like curious interest rather than fear. "She's not crying," George observed with relief as they approached the church doors. "I think she likes all the attention." Catherine smiled down at him, her face radiant with happiness and pride. "I think you're right, George. She's being very good for her first big public appearance. The interior of the church was cool and peaceful compared to the excitement outside. Sunlight streamed through the beautiful stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the ancient stone floors. George had been inside this church many times before, but today it felt different, more sacred somehow. The familiar smell of old wood and stone mixed with the sweet fragrance of fresh flowers that had been arranged specially for the ceremony. Family members and close friends were already seated in the wooden pews, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum of anticipation. George recognized many faces, his godparents, family friends who had been part of his life since he could remember, and relatives he saw mostly during special occasions like this one. As they made their way toward the front of the church, George felt the weight of all the eyes watching them. But rather than feeling nervous, he found himself feeling proud. This was his family, his baby sister, and this was their special day. The cameras that had seemed so overwhelming outside now felt less important than the warm, loving atmosphere inside the church. The archbishop who would perform the christening stood ready near the ancient stone font that had been used for royal baptisms for generations. George remembered his own christening here, though only from the photographs his parents had shown him. Today, he would get to watch as Charlotte experienced this same important tradition. "Can I sit close to Charlotte during the ceremony?" George whispered to his father as they took their places near the front of the church. "Of course," William replied, placing a reassuring hand on George's shoulder. "You're her big brother. Your job is to be here for her during all the important moments in her life." As the family settled into their seats, George looked around at all the people who had come to celebrate Charlotte's christening. The church was filled with love and warmth, and he could feel how special this moment was not just for his family, but for everyone present. This was more than just a ceremony. It was Charlotte's official welcome into their family's long history and traditions. Charlotte remained peaceful in her mother's arms, occasionally making soft baby sounds that seemed to blend perfectly with the quiet atmosphere of the church. George reached out and gently touched her tiny fingers, amazed once again by how small and perfect she was. In just a few minutes, the ceremony would begin, and his baby sister would officially become Princess Charlotte in the eyes of the church and the world. The anticipation in the church was almost tangible as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. George found himself holding his breath, wanting everything to be perfect for Charlotte's special moment. This was a day they would all remember forever, and he was determined to be the best big brother he could be. The moment George had been waiting for finally arrived as the archbishop began the christening ceremony. His deep, gentle voice filled the ancient church as he spoke about the importance of faith, family, and community in Charlotte's life. George listened carefully, trying to understand the important words being said about his little sister. When it came time for Charlotte to be baptized, Catherine carried her carefully to the ornate stone font that had been used for royal christenings for over a century. The same font where George himself had been christened, where his father had been baptized as a baby, and where countless royal children before them had received this sacred blessing. "Watch carefully, George," William whispered as they approached the font. "This is the most important part of the ceremony." George stood on his tiptoes to get a better view as the archbishop gently took Charlotte in his experienced arms. The baby looked so tiny against his formal white and gold vestments, but she remained calm and alert, her wide eyes taking in the solemn moment. George held his breath, worried that Charlotte might start crying and ruin her perfect day. As the archbishop spoke the traditional words of baptism, George felt a strange sense of awe wash over him. He was watching his baby sister become officially welcomed into their faith and their family's long tradition. The holy water that would be poured over Charlotte's head was the same water that had blessed him, his father, and generations of royal children before them. "Charlotte Elizabeth Diana," the archbishop announced clearly, and George felt a thrill of pride hearing his sister's full name spoken so formally. The middle names honored both his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and his grandmother Diana, whom he had learned about through stories and photographs. Charlotte was connected to all these important women in their family's history. The moment of the actual baptism was surprisingly gentle. The archbishop cupped his hand and allowed a small amount of holy water to flow over Charlotte's forehead. Instead of crying as George had feared, Charlotte made a soft sound that seemed almost like contentment. She was being so good, so perfect for her special ceremony. "She likes it," George whispered to his mother, amazed by Charlotte's calm behavior. "Look how good she's being for everyone." Catherine's eyes sparkled with happy tears as she watched her daughter receive this important blessing. "She's perfect," she whispered back, her voice filled with emotion. "Our perfect little princess." As the ceremony continued with prayers and blessings, George found himself really looking at Charlotte, perhaps more intently than he ever had before. In her elaborate christening gown, surrounded by family and centuries of tradition, she seemed both incredibly small and somehow very important. This was his sister, his responsibility, his family member for life. The archbishop handed Charlotte back to Catherine, and the baby seemed completely content, as if she understood that something wonderful had just happened to her. The congregation smiled, and some wiped away happy tears as they witnessed this sacred moment in the young princess's life. But for George, the most magical moment came after the formal ceremony ended. As the family gathered around Charlotte for the traditional photographs, she suddenly opened her eyes very wide and seemed to look directly at him. For just a few seconds, it felt like she was really seeing him, really recognizing him as her big brother. "Hello, Princess Charlotte," George said softly, reaching out to touch her tiny hand. "Welcome to our family officially. I'm your big brother, George, and I'm going to take care of you always." Charlotte's fingers closed around his, and George felt a connection with his sister that was deeper than anything he had experienced before. This wasn't just his baby sister anymore. This was Princess Charlotte, a real member of the royal family, just like him. They would grow up together, share adventures together, and always have each other. As the photographer captured this sweet moment between brother and sister, George realized that today had changed something important. Charlotte wasn't just a tiny baby who lived in their house anymore. She was officially part of their world, their traditions, their family's long history. And he was officially her big brother, with all the responsibility and joy that came with that special role. The drive back to Kensington Palace was peaceful and happy. Charlotte slept contentedly in her mother's arms, tired out by her big day, but having performed beautifully throughout the entire ceremony. George sat quietly, thinking about everything that had happened and feeling proud of how well Charlotte had done during her first major royal event. "What did you think of Charlotte's christening, George?" William asked as they approached the palace. George considered the question seriously before answering. "I think Charlotte is going to be a really good princess," he said finally. "She was so brave today, and she looked beautiful, and everyone loved her. I'm proud to be her big brother." As their car pulled into the palace courtyard, George knew that this day would always be special in his memory. Not just because it was Charlotte's christening, but because it was the day he truly understood what it meant to be part of a family, part of a tradition that was bigger than any one person. Charlotte was now officially Princess Charlotte, and he was officially the proudest big brother in the world.